Take a slow breath and let the edges of the day soften. You don't need to do anything now except listen, calmly and easily, as a gentler voice carries you back through time. Picture London at night. Rain settling on old stone. The muted glow of lamps holding little circles of gold above slick pavements. A river moving like black silk beneath its bridges. In this quiet light we will follow the long arc of a life. One that moved from hunger to power, from forgotten doorways to whispered influence, then away again into memory. This is the story of Jack Spot Comer, told softly without jolts or sharp corners, so that if you drift into sleep the story will simply keep walking, steady as a watchman on his beat. He was born Jacob Colmore, later Comer, in Whitechapel, in London's East End, at the beginning of the 20th century, a place and time made from soot and stubbornness. His family were Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe, part of a wave that had crossed borders with hope sewn into the hems of coats. The East End was a maze of streets and lives, market stalls calling out like bright birds, sweatshops where needles flashed under gaslight, tenements soaked with steam and talk and dreams held together by string. Poverty was the first language, work was the second. Jack grew up with the noise of Petticoat Lane Market in his ears and the smell of pickled herring and paraffin in his lungs. He learned early how to read a street, the way a crowd shifts when trouble is near, the difference between laughter that invites and laughter that excludes, the look of a man searching for someone else's weakness to own for a while. He was bright, restless, and stubborn. School could not hold him for long. Money was short. Tempers were short. Winters were long. In the East End, boys who wanted to be left alone learned to become boys who were not easy to touch. He found boxing as a teenager, not because he loved the sport, but because it taught a different kind of certainty. Boxing handed out confidence and bruises in equal measure. It shaped his shoulders and his timing, made him quick with his hands and quicker with decisions. In a ring, arguments end cleanly. Outside, they multiply. But a boy who knows he can stand his ground walks differently through a hostile world. The East End taught him to keep his chin tucked and his eyes open. The gym taught him how to look calm while he did it. The streets had their own teachers. In the first decades of the century, protection rackets grew like ivy over the doorways of small businesses, cafe owners, tailors, stall holders. Men would come in pairs and speak softly about accidents that sometimes happened to unprotected windows or stock. Jack watched, learned who supplied muscle and who supplied brains, and understood that the difference between a bully and a boss was rhythm. When to press, when to pause, when to leave a silence that felt like a threat. In those years, anti-Semitism was a pressure in the air, sometimes a hiss, sometimes a shout. Fascist organizers tried to march their uniforms through the East End to make a point about who belonged and who did not. The community had its own answers. Jack was among those who stood physically between the black shirts and Jewish streets. He understood that force recognizes force, and that a line of men who refuse to be pushed is a sentence that carries meaning even for those who cannot read it. He was not a Robin Hood. He was a businessman of the unofficial city, and the unofficial city paid in cash. The lines between protector and racketeer blurred, as they always do when a man can choose to be both. He organized, he delegated, he saw the value of clean suits and clean ledgers, even while dealing in the unclean. He liked order because order made money easier to count, and he could be generous, calculating, loyal, and ruthless. Four corners of a square he moved around with ease. Between the wars, the East End shifted again. Men came home from the front needing work and finding little. The docks, the markets, the sweatshops kept moving but not always forward. In the cracks, betting took root. Bookmakers worked the racetracks and street corners. Wages grew wings and flew toward odds whispered like prayers. Jack learned the language of the turf, marks, runners, tips, stewards, starting prices, and discovered that money on the move creates an undercurrent you can ride if you're strong enough to keep your balance. He began to recruit men he trusted to become that balance. Doormen who turned into lieutenants, couriers who became treasurers, and a handful of quiet talkers who could reduce a room's temperature with a sentence. By the 1930s, the name Jack Spot Spot from Spot of Trouble, some said. Others said it was a childhood nickname that stuck, circulated beyond Whitechapel. He had stepped out of side streets and onto the broader map of London's underworld. He dressed well, carried himself with a formed politeness that could harden in an instant, and preferred the role of arranger to the role of hammer. He paid attention to the small economies, who supplied the booze to certain clubs, who owned the gaming tables, who lent at the back bar when a man was a little short on a Friday night. He believed that most fights could be prevented by clarity, and that most clarity could be purchased. The Second World War changed everything by changing the price of everything. Blackouts, rationing and displacement opened space for black markets to bloom. Meat and silk and cigarettes, petrol and pretty much anything that could be moved from a factory door to the back of a van. These became currencies for men who could assemble a chain and make it hold. Jack understood supply and demand with a cold clarity. He built relationships that reached from warehouses to clubs, from street vendors to racecourse bookmakers. His protection grew wider. In some rooms it felt like a blanket, in others like a net. During wartime, Londoners stayed out late when they could. Anything to forget the sirens. Dance halls filled with uniforms and nurses. Music wrapped itself around fear like a scarf. Jack's men stood outside and inside those doors, ushering problems away before they became headlines. He liked a room that glowed with safety because a safe room is a room that pays. He also liked the feeling of being the name that made other names sit up straighter. Power is a taste that either sickens you or makes you hungry. For Jack, it was an appetite he learned to measure carefully. When the war ended, rationing did not end immediately. Scarcity lingered in the cupboards and in the moods of men who had learned to live quickly during dangerous nights. Organized crime followed the second economy wherever it walked. Jack's influence stretched across nightclubs, racetracks, greyhound stadiums, and the little rooms above pubs where money changed hands more often than anyone admitted. He had rivals, men with nicknames that fit like gloves, men with their own entourages and their own ideas about jurisdiction. Among them was Billy Hill, smooth where Jack was direct, modern where Jack was traditional, expansive where Jack was meticulous. Rivalry did not begin with gunfire. It began with a mislaid favor, a poached client, a rumor told as a joke and repeated as a fact. Hill and Comer circled one another through proxies and prices. A bookmaker who paid a percentage to one was coaxed toward the other with the promise of fewer headaches. A club that bought its piece from Jack would be offered a better rate by Hill's men, and then reminded of that offer by visitors with careful hands. The city is big, but the circle of men who felt they ran it was small, and in a small circle, stories travel faster than trains. Jack's methods were straightforward. He liked to ask face to face. He liked to have two sturdy men nearby who could make the shape of his point if words fell short. He believed in the tone that says, "This is not a negotiation," without needing to say it. But rivals arrive with their own tones. It became a contest, not only of force, but of style. Hill appealed to men who wanted to feel they were graduating to something grander than the East End's old ledgers. Jack appealed to men who liked to know exactly where things stood and how tall the bill would be at the end of the night. The 1940s slid into the 1950s. London changed its coat. Bomb sites were rebuilt. New estates climbed out of old bricks. American music softened the edges of British nights. But in back rooms, the same arithmetic continued. Percentages, cuts, the cost of a promise, the price of a mistake. Jack kept his network tight. He expanded into more formal businesses where possible, restaurants with respectable front doors, a little more cloth on the table. Yet respectability is easiest to hold when no one tugs at the tablecloth. Jack could be quick to temper when he believed someone had betrayed him. He understood that betrayal, left unanswered, multiplies, but he also understood attention, and he preferred not to feed it. The more public a fight became, the more unpredictable the variables. Police with new instructions, prosecutors with fresh encouragement, judges ready to make examples. He therefore tried to conduct most of his corrections in rooms without windows. But there were incidents that made the papers all the same. the kind that turned a quiet name into a loud one and a private problem into a civic curiosity. On the racecourses, Jack's men and Hill's men sometimes brushed shoulders with civic friction. Protection of bookmakers' pitches was lucrative and contentious. The right to stand in a prime spot on a busy day is worth more than a gentleman would guess. The money changed hands fast, and so could loyalty. If a runner hesitated, both sides could claim him, and a man claimed by two bosses is in more danger from indecision than from any single opponent. Jack valued decisiveness. He believed that an uncertain man multiplies danger by two. The police were not idle. Scotland Yard understood that London's apparent calm rested on a second map drawn in invisible ink. Officers collected names and matched them to clubs and tracks and who left which pub by which door. Jack's years of outward composure did not fool them. Arrests came now and again, charges ranging from assault to conspiracy to restraint of trade. In court he dressed like a businessman and spoke like one, clipped and cool. Juries listened to posture as much as to fact. Sometimes he walked out smiling, sometimes he paid in time instead of money. The rivalry with Billy Hill eventually produced a breaking point. It didn't arrive as a trumpet flourish, but as the accumulation of cuts on the same fingertip. Accounts disagreed sharply about the details of particular confrontations. What is clear is that Hill's alliances, newer and more fluid, began to yield advantages. Jack's circle showed signs of strain. A lie repeated enough times in the right rooms turns into the kind of truth that moves markets. The old East End method, stare a man down across a table until he looks away, was meeting a new method that preferred to move the table to another room. The Cray twins were still sharpening their outlines in the 1950s, but their arrival cast a new kind of shadow. The power language of the next generation was colder, more theatrical in a different way. Flashier suits, faster cars, and a hunger for publicity that the older underworld considered an unnecessary risk. Jack belonged to a world that preferred smoke-filled rooms to flashbulbs. The ground beneath him shifted as clubs evolved, as tastes changed, as the city fell in love with its own reflection in shop windows. There were attempts on lives in those years, or at least attempts on reputations heavy enough to feel like attempts on lives. A fight outside a club could be reported as a near assassination or downgraded to a misunderstanding depending on who retold it. In one widely repeated account, Jack was injured in an attack that looked like a message written in muscle rather than ink. Whether this was the hinge on which his power turned downward or just a sign that the hinge had begun to creak, its effect was cumulative. People who had once stood close began to stand a little further away. Gradually, the circle that had once tightened around his chair loosened. Men who had built their small kingdoms within his larger one found reasons to keep more of their earnings. Meetings that used to end with yes began to end with perhaps. He pressed where he could, threatened when he had to, and discovered that time is the only rival for whom there is no effective answer. He was not old then, but he belonged to a map of the city that was being redrawn, and maps decide directions before drivers do. He began to step back. He tried his hand at legitimate ventures more completely, restaurants that paid taxes, businesses that signed leases in their own names. Legitimate life has its own rough edges, but the edges are visible, and their sharpness is covered politely in envelopes and minutes and receipts. Some ventures worked, some did not. He remained a figure who could make a room straighten its chairs. But the days when he could choose which chair every man occupied had passed. The city had new favorites, and the men who remembered him with a mixture of caution and affection that does not pay dividends but does make for comfortable conversations. In quieter years, those who knew him described an older man who enjoyed conversation, who told stories with practiced timing, who could make a point without raising his voice. He had been, for a long time, both threat and balm. He would protect a business from depredations he himself could bring to the door, and then he would leave them to decide which version of him they preferred. Later, when the temperature of his life cooled, he seemed to prefer the balm. Power once tasted doesn't easily leave the tongue, but it can be remembered with a smile rather than a bite. If you step back across the whole length of his life, the picture simplifies. He was a boy born into scarcity who found safety in standing straight and speaking first. He was a young man who discovered that, in a city divided by class and custom, you can build your own ladder if you carry it with enough confidence. He was a businessman in the shadow city, accounting in percentages that were felt rather than printed. He was a rival to men who wanted the same slice of night he claimed. And when time took his slice away, he found that mornings are not so bad when the phone rings less often. For a while, he was a line in every underworld conversation. What does Jack think? Has Jack been told? Will Jack accept this rate? Those lines fade when new names enter the game, and they fade further when the game itself changes shape. Yet his influence lingers in the way London learned to negotiate with its own shadows. Policymakers and police changed tactics partly because men like Jack had taught them where their maps were wrong. Club owners changed how they hired doormen and counted money because Jack's methods and Hill's methods and all the other methods made certain old habits too expensive to keep. We can slow down now and walk through one of those East End nights as if we were there, safe and invisible, listening as London runs its own errands. It is after the war. The streets bear new patches where bombs once carved their names, but laughter returns to its favorite corners. The club at the end of an alley has a door manned by someone with shoulders like a wardrobe and a memory like a tape recorder. Inside, the band's trumpet lifts above the chatter like a small, bright moon. At a back table, a man pays a bill for 2 tables because that is how goodwill is purchased. In an upstairs office, a ledger is closed with a satisfied hand. And outside, under the dripping gutter, a car idles, waiting for someone who does not wish to be seen leaving, but will be seen anyway by the person who matters. He had his faults, some of them hard. He did not forgive easily, and when he forgave, it was often because forgiveness benefited the business of the weak. He could be tender with the very young and exasperated with the very old. Loyalty he expected like a tide. Betrayal he treated as a storm that needed to be shut behind a door before it reached the street. He did not ask for sympathy when arrested and did not offer it when rivals were. He preferred cause and effect to speeches about justice. Justice is slow. Cause and effect can be arranged by Thursday. And yet, in this telling, which we have kept gentle for the sake of rest and clarity, we can allow that even men who move by such arithmetic are made of human pieces. He loved a good suit and the feeling of entering a room as if you owned it, but he also liked the old markets where stallholders shouted prices in voices that made a cold morning feel warmer. He respected mothers. He had known too many who had held families together with fragile hands. He respected anyone who could keep a business open for 10 years in a street that tried to close it every Saturday night. The end of his power did not arrive with a bang. It arrived like a long exhale. The phone rang less often with urgent voices. Meetings were moved, then cancelled, then rescheduled in rooms he no longer had the keys to. He continued to live in London, a man both known and unknown, remembered by some as a protector and by others as someone they had been relieved to forget. He walked through streets that no longer announced his presence to themselves. Sometimes a face would light up. Jack. Sometimes a face would look away. He took both as the price of a life lived loudly once. In the record books and the reminiscences, certain events stand taller. His role in resisting fascist marches through Jewish neighborhoods, his organization of protection that was, in truth, often extortion with the polite hat of insurance, his dominance of certain racecourse percentages, the feud with Billy Hill that became part of London's criminal folklore, his gradual eclipse as newer men took different kinds of stages. We can pass over each of these with a hand gentle enough to keep you drowsy and a light precise enough to be fair. He was not a hero. He was not only a villain. He was a man who understood his era very well and used that understanding to place himself at the center of certain maps. If your eyelids are heavy, you can let yourself drift now and keep only the outline. A boy in Whitechapel learning to read danger and opportunity. A young man in a gym turning uncertainty into something that looked like poise. A businessman digging wells in a desert and charging for the water. A rival among rivals finally outflanked by time and change. An older man remembering the good suits and the good stories. Grateful perhaps that the phone rings mainly with human news now. Birthdays, weddings, the arrival of grandchildren, a friend's funeral at a synagogue where the prayers have always sounded like rain on a warm roof. There is a river in every city, and London's carries a long ledger. It remembers the names of men who were weather for a season. It records in its own quiet way the debts that were paid and the ones that floated off on fog. Jack Spot Comer's name is written there, not in capitals, not in gold, but in strokes that do not wash away. If you listen closely at certain bends, you might hear a conversation about terms and trust and Tuesdays after lunch. But even that sound fades after a while into the broader music of a city that does not stop for anyone for long. We can end as we began, in a quiet night. Imagine the East End asleep. Petticoat Lane, stalls folded and covered, a cat finding its kingdom along a wall, a bicycle leaning like a tired friend against a stairwell. A few clubs remain open, their doors bumping quietly as people drift out into the cool. Somewhere a man in a good suit counts the week and decides it was not bad as weeks go. Somewhere an old boxer wraps his hands in his thoughts and remembers a punch he saw coming and slipped neatly, proud again of his timing. And somewhere a name is spoken softly, not as a warning now, not as a boast, but as a story told to pass the time between one breath and the next. Breathe in, breathe out. Let the story close its ledger. Let the rooms empty of their crowds. Let the cobbles dry. If you're not asleep yet, you can rest inside the simplicity of this thought. Every legend is a long negotiation with time, and time is always polite, always patient, always sure. Jack's negotiation is over. Yours, for tonight, is easy. Close your eyes if they're not closed already. The night keeps watch. The city hums far away. You are safe. Sleep.